My name is Maya Sinclair, and I was still wearing my scrubs, still smelling like hand sanitizer and the ICU, when my mother handed me an envelope at my own sister's engagement party and told me it would be easier for everyone if I just didn't come to the wedding. I stood there in the doorway of my parents' backyard, holding a card with my name misspelled on the front, while 40 relatives raised champagne glasses behind me for a toast I hadn't been asked to give. 20 minutes earlier, I had been holding the hand of a 19-year-old boy in the cardiac ICU while his heart rhythm crashed twice, coaching him through it in a voice that didn't shake, even though mine was the only hand he had. Now, I couldn't get my own mother to look me in the eye. I opened the envelope in the car alone, engine running, because some part of me already knew I shouldn't open it in front of them. Inside was a single folded page. Not a card, a printed email, forwarded from my sister Claire's fiancé, and at the bottom, in my mother's handwriting, for words, "We think it's best." I didn't understand yet what it was. I wouldn't understand for another 6 weeks, not until a nurse I trained sent me a screenshot at 11 at night that made my stomach drop through the floor of my apartment. Not until I found out my own family had spent 2 years building a story about me, quietly, patiently, at every dinner, every holiday, every phone call I wasn't part of, a story so convincing that my mother believed it more than she believed her own eyes. A story that started with my father's medical bills. A story that ended with my name on a document I never signed. I didn't cry in that car. I want you to understand that about me before we go any further. I don't shatter easily. I've held the hands of dying strangers and stayed steady. I've called codes and stayed steady. But steady isn't the same as unbothered, and steady people remember everything. I remembered the date. I remembered the forwarded email address. I remembered, most of all, that my mother had signed the card in an envelope meant to keep me away from my own sister's wedding, and that the real reason had nothing to do with the wedding at all. To understand how a family arrives at excluding one daughter from a wedding invitation list, you have to go back 3 years, to the night my father had his first heart attack. I was 22, 6 months into my first job as a registered nurse in a cardiac step-down unit, still learning the difference between a shift that goes smoothly and a shift that teaches you something you'll carry for the rest of your career. I got the call from my mother at 2 a.m. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. My father, Richard Sinclair, had collapsed in the kitchen. By the time I reached the hospital, not my hospital, a different one, 40 minutes across town, he was in the cath lab, and my mother was in the waiting room alone, because my sister Claire was 3 states away at a bachelorette weekend and hadn't answered her phone. I sat with my mother for 6 hours. I translated the surgeon's words into plain English when the medical jargon overwhelmed her. I asked the questions she didn't know to ask, about stent placement, about ejection fraction, about what widowmaker actually meant when the cardiologist used it casually, the way doctors sometimes do when they've said it 1,000 times and forgotten it lands like a bomb the first time you hear it. I held my mother's hand while she shook. I did not, at any point, tell her I was scared too, because someone in that room needed to not be scared, and I had already learned in 6 months of nursing that the someone is often you. My father survived. He needed follow-up surgery 8 months later, a more serious one, and after that, a long recovery that came with a mountain of bills insurance didn't fully cover, the kind of bills that quietly reshape a family's finances for years. My parents never talked about money in front of me growing up. It wasn't until Claire mentioned it once, almost in passing, that I understood how deep the hole was. Somewhere around $80,000 out of pocket, spread across 2 surgeries, physical therapy, and a specialist my father saw for a year afterward. I did what I thought any daughter would do. I started helping, quietly, without announcement, the way I do most things. I set up an automatic transfer from my checking account, $600 a month, sometimes more when I picked up overtime shifts, into my parents' account, and I told them it was for groceries and utilities because I didn't want it to feel like charity, and I didn't want my father, who has always measured his worth by what he could provide, to feel smaller than he already did lying in that hospital bed. I want to be clear about something because it matters for everything that comes later. I never once mentioned this money to Claire. Not because I was hiding it, but because it never occurred to me that it needed defending. I wasn't buying loyalty. I was just doing what felt obvious. Claire, meanwhile, was 24 and finishing her final year of an MBA program our parents were also helping fund, a separate, much larger financial commitment they'd made years earlier and never regretted, because Claire had always been the daughter people built plans around. She was engaged within the year to a man named Trevor Ashford, whose family owned 3 car dealerships in the next county over, and from the moment that engagement happened, something in my mother shifted. Weddings do that to families sometimes. They become a lens that magnifies whoever's inside the frame and blurs whoever's standing outside it. I didn't think much of it at first. I was working 60-hour weeks. My patients needed me in ways that left very little room to notice I was being slowly edited out of my own family's story. But nurses notice things. It's the job. You learn to read a room, read a chart, read a face that's telling you one thing while the numbers on the monitor are telling you another. And over the following year, the numbers on my family started telling a different story than the one I was being told out loud. The first time I felt it directly was at Thanksgiving, 14 months before the wedding invitation that never came. My mother mentioned, almost offhand, over the pie, that Trevor's parents had asked some questions about our family's finances, given the wedding would be a fairly large one and both families were contributing. I said, honestly, that I didn't know much about our family's finances beyond what I contributed myself, and my mother's face did something I'd never seen it do before. A kind of careful blankness. The face people make when they're deciding not to correct you. I let it go. I had a 12-hour shift the next morning. I didn't yet know that letting it go was becoming a pattern I would look back on with real regret. The second time was 6 months later at my father's birthday dinner. Claire arrived late, visibly upset, and pulled our mother into the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The kitchen in my parents' house opens almost directly onto the dining room, but I heard my sister's voice crack as she said, "Trevor's mom keeps asking why Dad's medical debt still isn't cleared if Maya makes what she makes." I heard my mother's voice, low, tired, say something I couldn't fully catch, except for the last 4 words, which landed on me like a hand against glass. "She doesn't help enough." I sat at that table with a slice of birthday cake in front of me, my card to my father already given, my $600 transfer already scheduled for the 15th like it had been every month for 2 years, and I said nothing. Because in that moment, I genuinely believed it was a misunderstanding. I believed if I simply mentioned, gently, what I'd actually been contributing, it would resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. It got worse. And the reason it got worse is the first real twist in the story, the one I wouldn't discover for another 11 months. My mother knew exactly what I was contributing. She had known the whole time. She had simply decided, for reasons that took me a long time to untangle, that it was more useful to Claire's engagement, and to her own standing with Trevor's family, if that contribution didn't exist in the version of our family she was telling other people. I found this out by accident, the way most quiet truths eventually surface. I was at my parents' house dropping off a birthday gift for my niece, my cousin's daughter, and my mother's laptop was open on the kitchen counter to her email. I wasn't looking for anything. I was reaching past it for a set of keys. But an email subject line caught my eye before I could stop myself from reading it. Wedding budget, family contribution breakdown. I shouldn't have opened it. I'm not going to pretend that part of this story is noble. But I did, and inside was a spreadsheet my mother had sent to Trevor's mother 3 weeks earlier, itemizing what each side of the family was contributing to the wedding and, underneath it, almost as an aside, a paragraph explaining the situation with our other daughter, that I wasn't in a position to help much given her career choice, that nursing doesn't pay what people think, and that my father's ongoing medical costs were mostly still out of pocket. Every single word of that paragraph was false. And it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was written with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who knows the truth and has decided, deliberately, to say something else. I closed the laptop. I took my niece's gift out of the bag, left it on the counter, and drove home without saying goodbye to anyone. I didn't confront my mother that day. I want to explain why, because I think it's the most important decision I made in this entire story, and it's the decision that eventually gave me everything I needed to protect myself. I have watched in hospital rooms what happens when people react in the heat of the moment, how quickly a crisis can be made worse by someone acting before they understand the full shape of what they're dealing with. I had a feeling, sitting in my car outside my parents' house, that this spreadsheet was not the whole story, that there was more beneath it. And I was right. 2 weeks later, I stopped my automatic transfer. Not out of spite, out of clarity. If my help wasn't going to be acknowledged, wasn't even going to be allowed to exist in the version of events my mother was telling other people, then I needed to understand what my money had actually been going toward before I kept sending it blindly into a story I clearly wasn't part of. I called my father's cardiologist's office, which I was legally allowed to do. My name had been listed as an emergency contact and secondary point of communication since his first heart attack, something the office confirmed was still active on file. I asked, simply, whether there was still an outstanding balance related to his surgeries. The billing coordinator, a woman named Denise who I'd spoken with a dozen times over 2 years, paused for a moment and then said something that changed the entire shape of this story. "Sweetheart, that account was paid off in full about 1.5 years ago." 1.5 years. That meant my $600 monthly transfers for the better part of a year had not been going toward medical debt at all. They had been going somewhere else entirely. I didn't say anything to my parents. Not yet. I wanted to understand where 1 year's worth of money, over $7,000 by that point, had actually gone, and I wanted to understand it the way I understand everything, methodically with evidence, before I said a single word out loud that I couldn't fully support. I started small. I pulled 12 months of my own bank statements, highlighting every transfer, matching dates and amounts. Then I did something I want to be honest about, because I think honesty matters more than making myself sound clever. I asked my Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister, who I'd always been close to and who had no reason to lie to me, whether she knew anything about the wedding budget. Patricia didn't know I'd seen the spreadsheet. She simply mentioned, in the middle of an unrelated conversation about caterers, that your mom and dad put a good chunk toward the venue deposit last spring. I think Trevor's parents were impressed, honestly, given everything with your dad's health. Last spring, which lined up almost to the month with when Denise told me the medical debt had been cleared. I want to pause here and say something clearly, because I think it's easy in stories like this to imagine the villain as someone twirling a mustache, plotting cruelty for its own sake. That's not what happened in my family, and I don't think it's what happens in most families. My mother didn't wake up one day and decide to erase me. I believe, even now, that she loved me. What happened is smaller and sadder than a villain's plot. She was embarrassed by how much of the wedding was being funded by money my father hadn't technically earned, in the traditional sense he valued. Some of it my contributions, redirected without my knowledge, some of it a loan against their house he was too proud to admit to. And rather than sit inside that discomfort, she rewrote the story so that the discomfort disappeared. She made me the reason the numbers didn't add up, instead of the reason they did. That doesn't make it forgivable. It makes it human. And understanding that difference is, I think, what let me handle everything that came next without turning into someone I wouldn't recognize in the mirror. I didn't confront anyone yet. Instead, I did something my job had trained me to do better than almost anything else. I documented. I made a simple folder, bank statements showing every transfer, dated. Denise's confirmation, which she was kind enough to put in a brief written note on hospital letterhead when I asked, stating the date the balance reached 0. Screenshots of the spreadsheet email, which I'd forwarded to my own account the moment I found it, in case my mother ever deleted it. I wasn't building a legal case. I want to be honest that revenge, for most of this story, wasn't even the word in my head. The word in my head was proof. I think there's a difference. And I think it's the difference that let me stay calm. Then came the engagement party and the envelope and the 4 words in my mother's handwriting. We think it's best. I still didn't know, sitting in my car that night, exactly what it referred to. I assumed, wrongly, that it was simply about the wedding, that maybe Trevor's family had asked pointed questions about me specifically, or that my mother had decided the tension wasn't worth managing on the actual day. I was wrong. It was worse, and I found out how much worse from Priya, a nurse I had trained 2 years earlier, who had transferred to a different unit but stayed a close friend. Priya's fiancé worked at the same dealership group as Trevor's family. 6 weeks after the engagement party, Priya sent me a screenshot at 11 at night with the message. Do you know about this? I didn't know if I should tell you. The screenshot was from a family group chat Priya's fiancé had been added to by mistake, a joint one between the Sinclairs and the Ashfords, set up for wedding logistics that had briefly included a work contact of Trevor's before he was removed. In it, my mother had written a message explaining to Trevor's entire extended family that they'd decided not to invite me to the wedding because I had struggled with some serious personal issues the last couple of years and they didn't want anything disruptive on Claire's big day. I read that message 4 times before I could fully process it. My mother had not simply excluded me. She had invented a story about instability, about disruption, about serious personal issues, vague enough to imply anything, specific enough to make people not ask questions, and she had told it to 40 or 50 people I had never met, in order to explain away my absence without ever having to explain the actual reason, that I had found out the truth about the wedding budget, and my mother would rather erase me from a guest list than have that truth surface at her daughter's wedding. I sat with that message for a long time. I felt something in my chest that I recognized clinically before I recognized it emotionally, the tight, hollowed-out sensation I'd seen on the faces of family members in hospital rooms right before grief fully lands. I want to tell you I didn't cry, to stay consistent with what I told you at the start, and that's true. But I sat on my kitchen floor for almost an hour with my back against the cabinets, and if that isn't a form of crying, it was close enough that I don't think the distinction matters. What happened next wasn't rage. I want to be precise about that because I think rage would have led me somewhere unrecognizable, somewhere I couldn't have lived with afterward. What happened next was the same instinct that had carried me through every code I'd ever run in that ICU, a kind of narrowing focus, a stripping away of everything except what the situation actually required. I thought about what I actually wanted. Not to hurt my mother, I want to be honest, even now, that some small part of me still loved her too much for that to be the goal. What I wanted was simple, and it took me most of that night on the kitchen floor to name it clearly. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere my family couldn't erase it. I wanted, just once, for the story being told about me to be the accurate one. So I built that story, carefully, the way I'd build a case chart. Timeline first, evidence attached to every claim, nothing exaggerated, nothing I couldn't back up. And then I decided where it needed to go. Not to Trevor's family directly. That felt cruel, and more importantly, it wasn't really their business how my family had treated me. It would only humiliate Claire, and despite everything, I didn't want that. Not to social media. That felt like it would cost me more than it would ever give back, and I had built a career and a reputation I valued far more than a moment of public vindication. Instead, I decided it needed to go to the one place where truth still mattered more than comfort in my family, my father. Because here is something I hadn't told you yet, something that changes the entire shape of the story. My father didn't know about the spreadsheet. My father didn't know his medical debt had been paid off using money he thought was going toward groceries, redirected instead, without my knowledge or consent, toward a wedding venue deposit he believed had come from savings. My father didn't know his wife had told 50 strangers his younger daughter was unstable. My mother had built this entire architecture of half-truths not with my father, but around him, the same way she'd built it around me. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon between shifts and asked if I could come by alone, without my mother there. He said yes without asking why, the way he always had, because whatever else was true in my family, my father had never once doubted me the way my mother had learned to. I sat across from him at the kitchen table where I used to do homework as a kid, and I opened the folder. I didn't lead with anger. I led with the bank statements laid out chronologically because that's how you tell someone something they're not going to want to hear. You give them the facts in an order that lets them arrive at the conclusion themselves, instead of forcing it on them. I watched my father's face as he moved through the transfers, watched him do the math, watched him reach the note from Denise confirming the debt had cleared 18 months earlier. He was quiet for a long time, longer than I expected. Then he asked, in a voice I'd only ever heard him use once before, in a hospital hallway right after his surgeon told us the second procedure had gone well, "Where did the rest of it go, Maya?" I showed him the spreadsheet screenshot next. I watched something in his face change. Not shock exactly, more like the specific, quiet devastation of a man realizing a story he'd trusted for years had a hole in it he'd never noticed. And then I showed him the group chat message, the one about serious personal issues, and I watched my father, a man who does not cry, who I had seen stay dry-eyed through both of his own heart surgeries, put his hand over his mouth and sit like that for almost a full minute. "She told people you were unstable," he finally said, "to explain not inviting you to your sister's wedding, instead of just telling them the truth." "I think," I said, and I chose my words carefully because I meant them. She didn't know how to tell the truth without it costing her something with Trevor's family. And I think it was easier to spend a story about me than to spend the truth about the venue deposit. My father didn't say much else that day. I didn't ask him to do anything. I want to be clear about that. I never once asked him to confront my mother, to fix it, to choose a side. I simply told him I wanted him to know because it was his money too, his name attached to a debt that had actually been cleared using mine, and because I didn't think it was fair for him to keep believing a version of his own family that wasn't true. What happened over the following 3 weeks wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. It was quieter than that, and I think quieter is often how real consequences actually arrive. My father asked my mother, calmly, at their own kitchen table, to walk him through the wedding budget line by line, the same way I had walked him through the bank statements. My mother, who had built her version of events around the assumption that no one would ever compare the pieces side by side, did not have an answer that held together. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I've never asked for every detail, because I think some things inside a marriage aren't mine to hold. What I do know is that my father, for the first time in longer than I can remember, told my mother clearly that he would not attend Claire's wedding as a happy, willing participant in a story that erased his other daughter, not unless the story got corrected. My mother's first instinct, Claire told me later, crying on my apartment doorstep, was to try to manage it quietly. To tell Trevor's family there had been a miscommunication and that I'd actually be attending after all, with no further explanation. I understand why she tried that. It's easier to patch a hole than to admit you dug it. But it didn't work, because Claire, my sister, who I want to be honest had very little to do with any of this, who had been kept almost as in the dark as my father, asked me directly, sitting on my doorstep 3 weeks before her own wedding, whether this serious personal issues story was true. I told her everything, calmly, with the folder, because by then I understood that the folder wasn't really a weapon, it was just the truth, organized in a way that made it impossible to argue with. I watched my sister go through the same quiet devastation my father had gone through, watched her realize that the sister she'd occasionally resented for not helping enough, the sister she'd half believed was somehow unstable or unreliable, had in fact been quietly funding their father's recovery for 2 years while being systematically erased from the story of her own family. Claire didn't apologize with a speech. She apologized by doing something that mattered far more to me than words. She called Trevor's mother herself the following morning and corrected the record. Not with cruelty toward our mother. Claire protected her from the worst of it, softened the framing, called it a misunderstanding about the family finances that's been resolved, rather than laying out every detail. But she made one thing unambiguous. I was invited to the wedding. I had always deserved to be invited, and the story about personal issues had never been true. I want to tell you the wedding was some enormous, cathartic scene where everyone hugged and cried, and everything was repaired. It wasn't, and I think it's more honest to say so. My mother and I sat 2 tables apart. We spoke maybe 4 sentences to each other the entire evening, mostly logistics, where the coat check was what time the toast started. Some things don't heal on a single night just because the facts finally line up. But I was there. My name was on the seating chart, spelled correctly this time. My father, during his father of the bride toast, said something that I've replayed more times than I can count. He thanked Claire for her joy, thanked Trevor's family for their warmth, and then, looking directly at me across the room, said, "And I want to thank my daughter Maya, who has spent the last 2 years quietly taking care of this family in ways most of you never knew, and in ways I'm ashamed I didn't see sooner myself." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. I watched my mother's face while he said it, and I saw something in it I hadn't expected. Not defensiveness, but something closer to grief. The recognition of a story finally correcting itself in front of the very people she'd told the wrong version to. I didn't need her to apologize that night for it to feel, finally, like enough. I think that surprised me most of all, that the goal I'd been chasing without fully naming it, sitting on my kitchen floor the night I read that group chat message, wasn't really justice in the dramatic sense.
It was simpler than that.
I wanted the truth to be the thing standing in the room instead of the story that had replaced it. And on that night, for the first time in 3 years, it finally was. My mother and I have slowly, carefully started rebuilding something since then. It isn't what it used to be, and I've made peace with the fact that it may never fully be. But she apologized eventually, not with a speech, either, just a quiet phone call about 4 months later where she said, "I let embarrassment write a story that hurt you, and I don't have a good enough reason for why, and I think that was more honest than any grand gesture could have been." I still work in that same cardiac ICU. Last month, I held the hand of a woman in her 60s while her husband sat beside her, terrified, asking me question after question about what the numbers on the monitor meant, and I answered every single one, calmly, the way I always do, because that's the part of me nobody in my family ever had to fight to see clearly. My patients have never once needed proof of who I am. They've never needed a folder, a spreadsheet, a timeline of bank transfers. They simply trust the person standing in front of them, holding their hand, telling them the truth as gently and as clearly as I can. It took my own family 3 years, one spreadsheet, and a folder full of evidence to finally see the same thing my patients had understood about me from the very first minute I walked into their rooms. I didn't need the wedding invitation to know my worth, but I'm glad, in the end, that the truth found its way back into the room anyway, not because I forced it there with anger, but because I simply refused to let it stay erased.